Part 2, Ukraine Conflict, U.S. Proxy War Against Russia. Chapter 4, Shock and Awe, Then and Now. Shock and awe was George Bush Jr.'s name for his attack on Iraq in 2003. A United Nations report described the effect on Iraq as near apocalyptic, sending Iraq back to the pre-industrial age. But it wasn't enough. After a decade of sanctions against Iraq, which further decimated the country and its people, George Bush Jr. launched a new invasion in 2003. Together with a parallel war in Afghanistan, the world has seen 2 decades of wholesale death and destruction at the hands of the U.S. military at a cost of trillions of dollars and countless deaths, estimated between 1 and 2 million. When the savage of the U.S. war was exposed by WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning, the official U.S. reaction was to demonize the whistleblowers as if they were terrorists. Commenting on official U.S. historical condemnations of Russia and U.S. cover-ups of its own aggression elsewhere, Margaret Kimberly wrote that it is the white supremacist underpinnings of U.S. NATO foreign policy which have created all of Ukraine's suffering. The narrative that only white people deserve peace and security is all the more shameful because the global South suffers from war and deprivation as a direct result of U.S. NATO actions. It is NATO that destroyed the nation of Libya, NATO which attempted to do the same in Syria, NATO that occupied Afghanistan, NATO which wages war across African countries with U.S., French, and British troops deployed across the continent. Kimberly added that Ukraine has been pushed to the forefront of American thought in order to defend the imperialist foreign policy which led to the current conflict with Russia. If the blue-eyed nation is suffering, it is because of U.S. and NATO arrogance and aggression. Ukraine's current situation is a direct result of the 2014 coup engineered by the U.S. and its EU partners. An elected president was dispatched and a civil war began that has killed some 14,000 people. Ukraine is a U.S. colony with a puppet government now under military attack. There is a 4-panel cartoon here by Tim Murphy. In the first panel, Biden tells the reporter, "We back a fascist coup which provokes Ukraine's nuclear-armed neighbor, Russia." Next panel, "Then we threaten to put nuclear missiles in Ukraine, which borders Russia." Next panel, "Then we back and arm a civil war against Ukraine's Russian-speaking population." Reporter says, "Wow, that Putin is a madman." John Mearsheimer, a leading proponent of the realist school of international relations, echoes Kimberly on the cause of the current crisis. In 2014, after the coup that brought far-right Ukrainians to power, Mearsheimer wrote that the United States and its European allies share most of the responsibility for this crisis. End quote. He told the New Yorker, quote, "All the trouble in this case really started in April 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, where afterward NATO issued a statement that said Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. The Russians made it unequivocally clear at the time that they viewed this as an existential threat, and they drew a line in the sand." End quote. Despite intense war hysteria and propaganda, the BBC admitted on February 28, 2022, that many of the viral claims about, quote, "Russian atrocities," end quote, were false. In the Donbass, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights found that more than 14,000 people had been killed between 2014 and early 2022, with another 50,000 non-fatal casualties. About 2 million Ukrainian refugees escaped to Poland and other European countries in early 2022. Another 1 million Eastern Ukrainians were evacuated to Russia, which is seldom reported in Western mainstream media. Official U.S. government claims, echoed by the mainstream media, of global condemnation of Russia are not validated by reality. Much of the global south, led by China, India, Pakistan, Middle Eastern and African countries, and a substantial number of Latin American ones, have abstained from the avalanche of condemnations of Russia by the U.S. and its European allies. The U.S. is waging a new shock and awe campaign, shipping countless tons of war material, mobilizing neo-fascist volunteers to join an insurgency against Russia, and urging NATO ally Poland to lend Soviet-era bombers to Ukraine. President Zelensky of Ukraine is demanding a no-fly zone with strong support from many U.S. members of Congress. That would mean U.S. fighter jets shooting down Russian aircraft. Quote, "It means starting World War III," according to Senator Marco Rubio. Sanctions threaten global economy. Sweeping sanctions imposed on Russia by the U.S. and Western Europe threaten the global economy. The Biden administration has imposed an embargo on Russian oil, frozen Moscow's central bank assets, and attempted to cut off most Russian banks from the SWIFT bank transfer system, not including the banks European countries use to pay for Russian gas they urgently need. All civilian air traffic between Europe and Russia has ended, and shipments of virtually all commerce to and from Russia have been frozen. U.S. and European companies have pulled out of Russia with uncertain consequences. Who gets hurt by this shock and awe campaign? It may be too early to tell. Starvation looms in North Africa, which depends on wheat from Russia and Ukraine. The COVID-19 pandemic paralyzed the economies of many countries. As they struggle now to recover, this new hit could be a major blow. Gasoline prices and general inflation are rising everywhere. European countries may not continue going along with the sanctions. Economist Michael Hudson argues the U.S. war on Russia is actually a U.S. war on Europe to keep the EU subordinated to U.S. capital. Now European industry is shutting down as energy prices soar due to sanctions. Hudson says U.S. sanctions aim to prevent America's NATO and other Western allies from opening up more trade and investment with Russia and China, to keep them firmly within America's own economic orbit. To offset the loss of Russian oil on the global market, the U.S. has rushed to reopen negotiations with Iran and Venezuela. This is a sign of overextension. One set of U.S. sanctions complicates or even cancels others. Russia offers ceasefire and peace talks. On March 7, 2022, Reuters reported that Russia offered to immediately cease hostilities, to end its military actions in a moment, if Ukraine and the West could do 4 things. Cease military action as part of a wider ceasefire, change Ukraine's constitution to enshrine neutrality and pledge to stay out of NATO, acknowledge Crimea as Russian territory, recognize the separatist republics of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. A New York Times report on March 10, 2022, said talks failed to stop the fighting. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said Russia remained open to talks, suggesting a meeting between the presidents. Lavrov highlighted Ukrainian President Zelensky's recent comments that he was prepared to make concessions over Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO to stop the war. Quote, "We are ready to discuss security guarantees for the Ukrainian state, along with security guarantees for European countries, and of course, for the security of Russia," Mr. Lavrov said. And the fact that now, judging by the public statements of President Zelensky, an understanding of just such an approach is beginning to take shape, inspires a certain optimism. The Times reported that the White House press secretary said the United States also speaks to Mr. Putin's interlocutors before and after all these conversations. Medea Benjamin and Nicholas Davies reported that after President Zelensky's election in 2019, Ukraine's extreme right threatened him with removal from office or even death if he negotiated with separatist leaders from Donbass and followed through on the Minsk Protocol, which would grant autonomy to the Donbass region. Zelensky had run for election as a peace candidate, but under threat from the right, he refused to even talk to Donbass leaders, whom he dismissed as terrorists. John Mearsheimer said he thinks the Russians would be willing to live with a neutral Ukraine and that it won't be necessary for Moscow to have any meaningful control over the government in Kiev. They just want a regime that is neutral and not pro-American, he said. A role for China? U.S. Secretary of State Blinken has called Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi numerous times during this crisis, pressing China to use its leverage on Russia. Each time, the Chinese have emphasized rock-solid friendship with Russia. Wang told Global Times March 10, 2022, "We would like to see an early ceasefire and cessation of fighting, which is also the common aspiration of the international community." End quote. The Global Times report said the major consensus reached by Chinese, French, and German leaders during a virtual summit was, quote, "The sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries must be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter must be fully observed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries must be taken seriously, and all efforts that are conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis must be supported." End quote. Concerning the rounds of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, Wang said that although there remain obvious differences between the two sides, the differences will be reduced each time the two speak. The hope for peace will increase, and the goal of a ceasefire and cessation of fighting will be further advanced. Quote, "China is ready to step up communication with France and push the UN Security Council to reach a relevant consensus," Wang said. Zelensky phoned Chinese President Xi in late April 2023. Xi told the Ukrainian president that China would send a special representative to visit Ukraine and other countries, quote, "to conduct in-depth communication with all parties on a political settlement to the crisis," end quote. A united anti-war movement? The Ukraine crisis has taken its toll, at least for the moment, on the still modest forces of the U.S. and international anti-war movements, according to Jeffrey Mackler, a founder and leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. He said two poles are emerging with counterposed strategic conceptions. Quote, "In the U.S., a growing minority, perhaps a majority, feels compelled to denounce with equal fervor both sides, Russia on the one and U.S. NATO on the other," end quote. In sharp contrast, he said, quote, "Organizations representing the major anti-war coalitions demand no to U.S. NATO war in Ukraine, no wars with Russia, no sanctions, no to NATO and NATO expansion, a central cause of the present crisis, and fund human needs, education, housing, the environment, and health care, not war," end quote. The group includes UNAC, Black Alliance for Peace, ANSWER, which stands for Act Now to Stop War and Eliminate Racism, Code Pink, International Action Center, Popular Resistance, U.S. Peace Council, Black Alliance for Peace, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Veterans for Peace, World Without War, and Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. These groups agree that the U.S. imperialist government, with 1,100 military bases around the world in 110 countries, is by far the world's greatest purveyor of force and violence. This all-encompassing violence includes an Orwellian-like U.S. and worldwide surveillance system, cyber wars aimed at disrupting or disabling vital communication and power generation systems, drone wars, sanction wars against 40 nations, embargo blockade wars, CIA special operation wars, death squad assassination wars, and open military interventions aimed at regime change and conquest. It also includes multilateral UN-sponsored humanitarian intervention in the name of democracy, as is the case of the present U.S. UN occupation of Haiti, he said. The Biden administration, in a required report to the U.S. Congress a few months ago, listed 158 countries where U.S. military operations are underway, and the U.S. AFRICOM, that is African Command, conducts military operations in 53 African countries, where there have been 5 coups d'etat just in the past year. In contrast, China maintains a single military base outside its borders in Djibouti at the Horn of Africa, while Russia maintains 6 military bases, mostly in the former Soviet republics and 1 in Syria. The U.S. spends more on its military, at least $1 trillion annually, including the CIA budget, than most of the rest of the world combined. Russia's military budget is $60 billion. China's is about $232 billion. China and Russia are near totally surrounded by U.S. military bases. Who are the imperialists? Mackler says defining China and Russia as imperialist countries along with the U.S. and concluding that they must be equally condemned is wrong. Quote, U.S. imperialism planned and orchestrated a fascist-led coup aimed at obliterating the minority Russian-speaking people, 30% of the population, and the same U.S. government seeks to orchestrate Ukraine's affiliation to NATO, replete with nuclear weapons on Russia's doorstep. End quote. Ukraine's oppressed Russian-speaking population has asked Russia for aid in this crucial matter, Mackler says. We support this right of all poor and oppressed nations to be free from imperialist war and conquest. This includes their right to seek aid from other nations to help defend their sovereignty, if not their very existence, he said. Oil wars are the U.S. stock in trade, Mackler says, from the outright theft of Iraq's oil via the U.S. war against Iraq to the sanctions, coup attempts, and hot wars against Venezuela, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Iran, all aimed at keeping their competitive oil off the world market or transferring it outright to U.S. corporations. Michael Hudson adds that the aim of U.S. sanctions is to keep the world oil trade firmly under U.S. control, because oil is energy, and energy is the key to productivity and real GDP. U.S. imperialism lit the fuse that ignited and sustains the present war in Ukraine, Mackler concludes. The U.S. anti-war movement's simple demand, U.S. NATO out now, remains central to its future success. He calls for a united front, democratic and mass-action anti-war movement capable of defeating the U.S. warfare state's endless atrocities. Quote, U.S. working people, allied with the nations oppressed and exploited, have a key role to play in the coming struggles. End quote.